having planned this for a long time, it's so much fun to see it coming together. And that's all of you who are making the connections and creating the relationships. And planning this, I also thought it would be really nice to have a conversation as ending the formal parts of the day with people who come from maybe different backgrounds, but also who share still joint threads and interests. And when describing this panel, which I'm sorry, I've been so fluid and it's been organic, and I should have been much more precise. So you've been very good sports about this, by the way. So it's really, I think personally, it's difficult to navigate all these ideas and thoughts about how I am as an individual, as we've also touched upon several times during the conference, should think about my role and responsibility today. In crisis, or from crisis, or should we call it crisis? Because just moving from crisis to crisis doesn't seem to make much sense either, right? And since this feels very urgent to many of us, it's so easy to just jump on the bandwagon of the next new thing, right? So you really want something to hold on to, and you find that which you think is a star, and you grab on for dear life, and you think you're going out, you think you're looking out in eternity, looking into the night sky, and then the star starts to move, and you realize it's a satellite, right? Or just a piece of space junk that we have put out there. So you're actually only staring back at a very bad version of yourself. So that's something that I think many of us struggle with and think about. Also what kind of, I don't know if we should call it traps to avoid when moving in these times. And how should we keep our critical thinking when we're also, looking for something to cling on to? And what are the questions that we cannot leave behind just because it's difficult or inconvenient to ask them in this dire situation that I think we all can agree we find ourselves in. So thank you so much for being here and perhaps answering some of these questions together. So how this is going to work is that all of these guests will get a little bit of time on their own to just present some questions, ideas, and then they will be given the opportunity to reflect on each other, and you will get the opportunity to ask questions, and I also have some questions prepared in case it becomes silent, which is fine, because they're pretty good questions too, I think at this point. Hopefully this will just go naturally, and we'll see. Patricia Lorenzoni, she's new to this conference, coming in this morning, being a really nice person and traveling quite far actually this morning early to come here. You're an author, cultural critic, research fellow at CEMFOR, the Center for Multidisciplinary Studies on Racism at Uppsala University. You're so many things. I'll also let you introduce yourself in a while. We have Mikael, whom you met before, Mikael Kurkiala, also author, researcher at the Swedish Church, cultural anthropologist. I think both of you have also lectured at CEMUS at different times. And Mattias, who is also new on the stage here, not for the first time here at the conference, but these days, author, also writer, and you write, you want to inspire change through film. Producer and facilitator, I would say. Would you say? Yeah? Yeah, you get to disagree at least.
Testing. So I don't know that I'm an author yet, even though that was my dream in 4th grade when the teacher made us predict. So I would strike author off the list, but the rest we'll keep. But basically film producer and director.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. And And also for those of you who are new to this setting, or also I think that brings us interesting, fresh perspectives now at the end of the conference. All right, I will actually let Mattias start with giving some thoughts on this, and we have a film. So the floor is yours, Mattias, and in order to be able to see the film, we on the stage should probably move like this.
So it's 2 minutes of a film, so it's not a full film, but can you hear me all right? Yeah. So my name is Mattias Olsson. I'm a filmmaker, film producer, and some of you may remember me from 2 years ago. I was here presenting a film that I made called Into the Soil. Where to begin? So I have a problem with, I don't know if you guys have seen documentaries on climate change recently or in your lives, or any documentary about a war or something wrong in the world. Most of them, to me, it seems that they take the topic, whatever it is that is wrong, pick it up and show it to us, and just say, look at this horrible thing, and then kind of put it back and walk away. And when you leave the movie theater, you feel disempowered, I would say. I don't know if this is your experience, but that's how I've felt when I've watched the documentaries of about climate change and so forth. About maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, I found there was a book that came my way, like books sometimes do. This particular book was called The Ascent of Humanity. Some of you may have read it. It's of an author named Charles Eisenstein. And that book is about how did we get here? What has led us to this point in history, basically. And it really resonated deeply with me, and it made me realize what it is that I'm supposed to do with all the gifts that I've been given. Throughout my life, I've been very privileged. Whatever doors I've knocked on, a lot of them have opened up. Education-wise, as a young man, I wanted to go to New York and work as a photo assistant, and I did. And then I wanted to stay in New York and work as a photographer, and I did. And then I wanted to become a documentary filmmaker, and so I went back to Sweden to go to film school. And all of these doors have just opened, and gifts upon gifts. And so after reading that book, I realized what I wanted to do, which is to make films that are solutions focused and that tackle the poverties of our times in a slightly different way, perhaps, than the general narrative out there. And there's a line somewhere, another book that has meant a lot for me is called Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. And somewhere in there it says, what if we belong to the earth as opposed to the earth belonging to us? And that's a very simple sentence, but there's some depth in there, and something in there is how I want to make films. So going back in time, maybe 2 years, I had this idea of, wouldn't it be great to go around Sweden and meet with different people who make a difference in different ways, different projects that are working for a vibrant future in different ways. Wouldn't that be cool to be able to just travel around and meet inspiring people and capture little stories and put that together as a film? And as I'm having these ideas, I get a phone call from a woman named Archie Passanen, some of you may know her, from the Transition Network here in Sweden. And she said, we've been talking about making a film about the Transition Network, and we were thinking about you. And I said, that's funny, I've been thinking about making a film, maybe we can share some ideas here. So we shared some ideas. And very quickly, or early on in the process, we decided that it wasn't that interesting to make a film about the Transition Network per se, but rather to make a film about omställning, about transition, about ideas, about things that we thought were worthy of bringing to light, things, projects, ideas that could be shared and spread. So at one point we were meant to show the film here, actually, but now I get to talk about it a little bit instead, so that's good too. And I thought we'd look at the opening of the film, which is the first 2 minutes of the film, and then I'll go into some more ideas about it after we've seen it.
Min dotter. Jag försöker föreställa mig henne som vuxen. Att hon kanske har egna barn. Och att jag är morfar. Sen ett steg till. Att jag inte är kvar här längre. Bara som någon slags eko. En förfader. Det sägs att mina handlingar är obetydliga i det stora hela. Tänk om man skulle strunta i att tänka så. Hur skulle vi påverka varandra och ekologin om vi skulle tro, nej, veta att vårt agerande, att den lilla människans agerande är av den absolut yttersta vikt?
Man kan se, den som vill och den som bor inte allt för långt ifrån Nacka, så vill jag berätta att man kan se hela filmen som är 75 minuter lång på NAV den 21 september. Och på, säg igen. Ja. 1 september. Bra, snyggt. Jag kan också berätta att Pella Thiel medverkar i filmen, men har inte sett den själv än, så det är kul. Dougald Hine medverkar också i filmen och har inte, tror jag, sett den. Sorry, this is supposed to be in English, right? When were you going to tell me? Nobody was going to tell me. Not even the English-speaking people. They're like, all right, let him go on. Let's see. So, yeah, you can watch it at NAV, the 21st, and at on the 1st of September. So, a couple of things. 3 things to talk about here, about the approach of the film and the angle, so to speak. So the first, I have another grievance with the way climate documentaries, let's call them, are presented to us. If we think about An Inconvenient Truth, take that as an example, and others, they're generally formed as like they show what's wrong, and then in the event that they give you some good ideas, they're all personalized. So they're all like, what can you do? How can you not fly? And how can you recycle? And you as a person. So that was the first thing that I wanted to deconstruct in this film. And you notice here that I begin with saying, what if the one person is, his or her decisions are super important? So it begins there, but then what would come if we would have kept watching the film? What happens next is that what if the one meets the other one? And then maybe a third person. So the film is about, you know how there's a gap between what can I do, how can I recycle, how can I stay on the ground? And then on the other end of the spectrum you have what can the UN do, what can Sweden do, what can, I don't know, Pepsi or whatever do. And that seems a little bit far, and this little thing seems a little bit little, but there's a pretty big space in between, and that's one of the aspects that this film goes into. What can you and I do together? What can we in this room do together? What can I do with my neighbors? What can we do in our family? So it's not really about so much about the one. It's a little bit more about the we of it. But the other, going back to the what if my decisions, what if the things that I do and don't do is super important. We tend to think about our actions and inactions and the consequences of our actions and inactions as something that's supposed to be measured right away, or maybe tomorrow or next week. But what if we add a longer timeline to our actions? And this was inspired actually by this Charles Eisenstein that I mentioned before. He came to Järna, where I live, to give a speech about 5 years ago or something, and I made a little film and I was able to meet him and talk to him. And he said something, he was on a podium like this and talking to people, something like this, and there was one little story that he said, and I told the same story the last time I was here, but that was 2 years ago, so I think it's worth repeating it. He said, who would you say is the most important historical person in the history of South Africa? So most people probably would say Nelson Mandela. But if you instead ask, what was it that made Nelson Mandela, after all of those years in prison and everything that he had to go through, what made it so that when he came out of that, he did not want blood revenge? He wanted to unite the people, and he had a different approach. What gave him that strength? So I don't know the answer to that, nor does Charles Eisenstein, but one guess is that perhaps his grandmother, Nelson Mandela's grandmother, that is, gave him so much love and wisdom when he was a child, and that he was able to carry that with him throughout his life and throughout all those 33 years or however much it was in prison, and to carry that through his life. And so that gives a different understanding of change, the idea of change. And so who's the most important person in the history of South Africa? Perhaps it was Nelson Mandela's grandmother. And so that's a way of thinking that I apply in this film. It's also inspired by Stephen Jenkinson, who we've seen here at this conference, who talks about behaving intergenerationally. So the film has, you saw there, my daughter is looking at a slide of my grandparents. So it's her great-grandparents. So the film has a timeline of looking 100 years ahead and 100 years back. So there's that span is present throughout the film. So that was two things. There's a third thing I want to say, and either I will think of what that is in the next 10 seconds, or I'll save it for later. Let's see. Maybe I'll save it. Maybe that's a good way to put the full stop right now.
Okay. Cliffhanger.
Cliffhanger, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mattias. Shall we take the stage? Is that okay? And now, since we don't have to be facing the film, I think we can move up here. And if you will, you can put up the drapes. Thank you. We will actually move on before a kind of reflection and giving Patricia the opportunity to share your thoughts that you brought with you here.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Mattias. I think I thought when I just saw the first 2 minutes, I didn't think it would be so much connection to what I'm saying, but now when I heard you talk about it more, I do see the connections, and I did prepare some questions departing from the question that was put in the name of this conversation. How do we differentiate between the stars and the satellites, between the stars and our own garbage? And I will just kind of introduce my approach to it by posing 3 questions on how we pose our questions. And for this sake, I am also constructing an imagined we here that I don't want to take for granted. An imagined we that is rooted in the global north and thus relatively privileged. We could also call it a hegemonic we. And firstly, when posing our questions, do we address, and in what way, forced displacement? According to the UNHCR, there are more than 100 million forcibly displaced people in the world today, and this is a situation that is unprecedented. The question of migration cannot be separated from the questions of ecological and climate crisis. Firstly, because ecological and climate changes are displacing a growing number of people. Secondly, because these same changes provokes intensified armed conflicts over natural resources, displacing even more people. And even traditional liberal democracies have met this crisis of forced displacement with increasing criminalization of border crossings. So rather than truly facing these new challenges of mass movements, states have opted for production of mass death at their borders, with severe consequences also. I think it's crucial that we never forget this for democracy as such. What I wish to stress here, what I believe, is that an unconditional solidarity from below is the only way of dealing with the joint ecological and displacement crisis we are facing without falling into political authoritarianism. My second question is, when posing our questions, do we address, and if so, in what way, capitalism? Do we dare call it by its name? This is crucial as well, for all this is not about the relation between humanity as a species and the rest of nature. This is about a specific historical configuration that has never included all of humanity anyways. As Brazilian writer Eliane Brum emphasizes, when we say humanity, that humanity has done this or humanity has done that, what we are talking about is a specific dominant class within humanity. And by talking about it, generalizing it as humanity, we are also depoliticizing and dehistoricizing it. Yanomami shaman David Kopenawa from the northern Amazon uses a term synonymously with white people, which is commodity people. Colonialism is what strives to transform anyone not conforming with a specific version of humanity into commodity people, and everything else into commodities, and even people, of course, into commodities. And lastly, my third question, when we pose our question, do we reach out and listen, really listen to the ones with relevant experience? We are here reflecting upon the existential experience of living at the end of times. But this experience is no stranger and no news among contemporary humanity, not if we look beyond the hegemonic we I constructed earlier. To see one's world end, the experience, very concrete experience of collapse or crumble, to live apocalypse, materially, practically, is part of the experience of many a refugee here and now where we are. But also, and in an even more radical way, it is the reality lived by people such as David Kopenawa, who have lived and experienced the mass death among the Yanomami resulting from epidemics and colonial violence in the Amazon. Eliane Brum, who I referred to earlier, argues that in order to understand what is happening in the world today, we need to understand what is happening in the Amazon. And she places specifically the Amazon, often understood as a periphery, as the very center of the world. And she does so arguing precisely around what is happening in terms of violence and colonialism and exploitation in the Amazon today. The Amazon indeed is a world where apocalypse is no stranger. But it's also a world, and this she also stresses, it's also a world where the shadow side of modernity, to connect to Dugard Hein's keynote yesterday, where the shadow side of modernity is open and present. We can see it here. It's open and present, as is the resistance against it. The colonial frontier in the Amazon is among the most violent places on earth. David Kopenhaver can testify to that. But it's also a place where the modern colonial world is still in the making, and that can therefore also gives us clues to its unmaking. Show us that other worlds are not only possible, they exist and resist in our present. So I just want to conclude with this reflection that if we are to distinguish our own garbage from the stars, we need humbly to let ourselves be schooled by the experiences of those who know what it means to exist and to resist through the ends of worlds. Thank you.
Thank you. Mikael?
Thank you so much. I have also worked and researched in a frontier zone, the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, which is a remnant of civilization that existed for many centuries. The world has, well, not the world, but worlds have ended continuously through human history. An organized, ordered world, a world of meaning, is a cosmos. And the Lakota cosmos was more or less devastated and destroyed by colonization. But the people are still there, and they still carry memories of their past. I had an adopted grandfather who was born in 1912. And one time I was sitting with him outside of the house under a shade, and he pointed to the west, and he said, my grandfather was in that big fight over that away. And that was the Battle of the Little Bighorn, when Custer was defeated by the Lakota warriors together with their allies, the Cheyenne. And the other world is just around the corner. It's very extremely close to us, and I would say in an existential sense, another world is constantly accessible to us right here, right now. But that is a spiritual question. I'll come back to that maybe later on. A couple of years ago when I was in Pine Ridge, I met a man who worked in a reservation school called American Horse School. This man he was Gary. He was a full-blood Lakota. This is the way they talk about themselves in terms of blood quantum. He was a full-blood Lakota man, and contrary to most Lakota men, he was very sociable and very open. The Lakota pretty much like my own people, the Finns, kind of reserved to strangers to begin with. But he was a very open and very hospitable person, and always smiling, extremely friendly. One time he asked me, could you take me back to my hometown where I grew up? It's a small town called Martin in South Dakota. It's about 1,000 people live there, 50% Native Americans, 50% white. But it's a white town. It's not part of the reservation. And Gary had grown up there in a housing program, which is outside the main town. This is where the Lakotas mostly live, in urban areas. They live in housing programs and extremely impoverished areas. So we sat in the car, we drove from the reservation maybe 45 minutes, and during this trip, as we approached near the reservation, or near the white town where he grew up, Gary was changing very tangibly. His language changed. He was using curse words, he was becoming aggressive, not towards me, but there was this pain that came very, very strongly. And the pain grew stronger and stronger the closer we came to the place where he grew up. So when we came to Martin, he said, "Can you take me to my housing program where I grew up?" It's about 1 kilometer outside of Martin. And so we drove there. And as we drove through the streets in this impoverished area, we passed the incredible amount of junk that is gathered around these Native American housings. Car wrecks, rusting metal, you name it. And Gary said to me, "You see all this junk lying around here. That's how people feel inside." So what he was pointing to was a direct connection between the environmental damage and psychological and cultural damage. And he made it so clear to me that it is a spiritual condition, that the destruction of the environment reflects a destruction of the soul. So in a situation like this, traumatized people conquered in a sense by the Washichu civilization, they are constantly talking about healing, the need for healing. And how do you heal? Two things are needed, I would say. There's healing and there's wisdom. And healing to the Lakota always involves rituals that are physical, embodied things that you do. They don't really trust psychologists traditionally. They don't really trust words in that sense, but you have to do things with the environment, with your body. You have to dance, you have to sweat, you have to experience pain. This is how healing comes about. There's also trust in the body, and I think that wisdom, when we look for wisdom, we tend to look for wisdom in words. And there's a lot of wisdom in words, but there's also a lot of wisdom in the body. And this is what the Lakota know. Healing comes from the physical, from nature, not only nature out there, but from our own nature. If I rub my palms together like this, after a while, it's going to get hot. And if I continue, I will get blisters, and you will feel the smell of burning flesh. Fortunately, there's a thermostat inbuilt in my body that says you have to stop. You're hurting yourself. So when that thermostat goes on, I stop because there's a wisdom. The body protects itself. But the spiritual thermostat is not automatic. It has to be trained. We have to train it. Otherwise, we hurt ourselves. And this is, I don't think it's a coincidence that overheating in the world, in the global warming, also corresponds to burnout syndromes among people. We are burned out. It's a mass epidemic. And I think that the metaphor of heating and overheating is a very strong one. I could talk much more about this, but I think that my time is out. Or, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
But we all do want you to talk more about this, definitely.
Okay.
So, thank you. Mattias, you pointed to, amongst other things, the space in between that has been up here several times. So my feeling is that's what you're also looking at. And this carrying each other, and you're talking about different generations, that we also listened to yesterday evening. For instance, the last song of the concert, or the mystery yesterday evening was a song on caring each other. And Patricia, you were talking about displacement and the need to see the whole picture, but not in maybe the typical sense, but really daring to look at that, and this ending of worlds, and there's multiple worlds. And I was also then thinking about a critical point that we have been touching upon, because several people here might be saying we need to find our place and rooting ourselves in a place, like a physical place, many might want to grow their garden or feeling a connection to place. But there's also a slight something happening there because we're missing a bit of solidarity sometimes, I think, and justice. So there's a tension sometimes, I believe, within this very strong anti-globalization feeling, because it's like a child, you know, you play with a toy until it breaks. Okay, I'll just do something else. I'll get a new toy, a new hobby. So, you know, I didn't like globalization. I'll just grow my garden. Growing your own garden like Khan did, right? So just reflecting on that. And I will let you respond to that. And Mikael, this thermostat and giving us these really understandings also of remembering that the soul and the body are not necessarily separate things, and the outer and the inner world are the same. Patricia, do you have any reactions to those thoughts? Or anything else you heard from the others?
Yeah, I think the connection I made with Mattias' project as you presented your film is about, I interpreted what you said as about building community, that there is a need of building community. And this building of community also has a lot to do with kind of rooting things, basing things in the local, which is tricky. It's extremely tricky, also given the historical moment that we are living, where with a growing political investment in the local, both the local in terms of national, regional, and really local in an exclusive and hostile way. And I'm very much inspired at the moment by this writer that I referred to, Eliane Brom, because I'm reading her at the moment. So it's her discussion of the Amazon kind of always comes to my mind. But she has a distinction when she discusses a specific group of people in the Amazon, which I think is really interesting and that we can learn something of. There is a group called the Beiraderos that usually these are people who live kind of moneyless economically at the margins of the rivers. And the history of these Beiraderos, they are not indigenous people. They have come through various migration waves from the northeast, some like centuries ago, some like 50 years ago. But they have kind of created their own communities, their own self-sufficient autonomous communities, and find themselves today many times in a constant struggle against those who want to exploit the forest. About the migration, these were poor peasants from the northeast who migrated with the promise of land. It's a colonial. They were colonialists. They were like the most humble class of colonizers. She says about their migration from the northeast, where they have their Brazilian origin, that it's their memory, but it's not their origins. And we are very much obsessed with origins, not least in Europe, right? And this distinction between memory and origin, she explains by placing the formation of the Beiradero culture and Beiradero community in a resistance against the colonial states they themselves were part of. That is what made them. They have a memory of the migration, but they are not Northeasterns because they are based here in this story of resistance. And I think when we talked, I started by talking about migration, right? And I did that for a reason, because I think that is one of the things that should be more in focus here. That is also a way to look at human mobility. We tend to call a migrant forever, but that is a memory. But there is so much more, and the present that makes the person here, and the connection to the place.
Thank you. Do any of you want to chime in?
Well, I just thought of the third thing a while ago, so I'll throw in that. But I also want to say that I keep going in and out of feeling like, well, what I'm talking about doesn't have so much to do with what you guys are talking about. But then there are moments where I'm like, yeah, but it's the same thing. But then I lose it, so it's... But I'll leave it for people with a better intelligence than myself to if there are dots, to put them together. But yeah, I feel that there's something there. But so the third thing that I thought of, the point of view of the film that I have made is this word climate anxiety. You have all heard this word, perhaps, or you may even have felt climate anxiety. And I feel like that has to do with when we envision what we need to do, what are the steps we need to take in order to, let's say, just for an image, to live on one planet. Let's use that as an image. So what are the steps that I would need in my household and our little place where we live? What would we need to do? And you start making the calculation, and I don't know if you guys have gone to those websites where you can put in, like, oh, I don't have a car, so you feel good about that. And, oh, I fly maybe once a year, and you feel a little bit bad, and you do the calculations. And maybe you get to, like, okay, so the Swedish average is we're living on 4 planets, but I live on 3, and you feel pretty good, until you realize that 3 is 3 more than we have. But in all of that, I feel like it's more about direction than being too goal-oriented. I think gives you handlingsförlamning, whatever that is in English. Like the lack of a feeling of that you can contribute and do something. So I feel it's very important to, if there's a way, if I have a way to inspire somebody to do one thing that changes their behavior, that makes them live on 3.9 globes instead of 4, that's something to celebrate. That's not something to look down on. And if you are living on 3.8 globes, you shouldn't look down on the 3.9 people and so forth. It's directional. It's not goal-oriented, at least for me. Then I just don't feel like I can get out of bed in the morning. It's just förlamande. Sorry for my throwing in some Swedish. Paralyzing, thank you. So that's what the film wants to do, and that's what I want to do. If I have anything to do with putting my gifts out there in the world, with all the privilege that I've had in my life, is to try to not lecture people about the 100 steps that they would need to do in order for us to be fully organic, but to just present like a smorgasbord of ideas, which is, in this film we go and visit 13 different projects of people doing very different things in cities, in the countryside. We were very careful to not have a film that was just 13 different ways to farm vegetables. So like farming, yeah, part of it, and food, of course. But what can you do if you live in the city and you don't really care for tomatoes too much? So I feel like that's very important to feel that direction, and that has taken, for me, in my case it's gardening. I knew nothing of gardening 8 years ago, and now I'm like so into the seeds and the tomatoes and building greenhouses and stuff. So that makes me feel good about getting out of bed in the morning. That makes me feel like I catch myself whistling, like. And tomorrow I've had very stressful weeks with an event that I put on in Järna the other day and so on. And tomorrow I just set aside the full day is just taking up potatoes, nothing else. So I don't know that you can make an argument and get away with it to say that spending the day taking up potatoes you can feel great about yourself, climate-wise or global-wise, whatever. But if you think in the form of directionality as opposed to goal-orientedness, I feel like that's something that I would like to pass on, and I'm trying to do that in the film and in the work that I do. And I think that connects to what you guys are saying, but I don't know exactly how.
Well, no one exactly knows how. Thank you so much for that comment, because I do also think that something that's been a strong sentiment here that's been very rewarding for me is this feeling that about the present, and that it's not always about reaching a goal. It's also something isn't worth less because it's not worth forever either. So, but I wanted to ask you, because you say there's something in between the you, like individual, and then the you and the UN, right? There's something there. And you have worked a lot with these communities now, different kinds of communities, be it. But what would you say is is there anything that you would say works? How do you get into that? How do you get into a community in the best possible way in your experience? Because personally find it sometimes difficult to connect.
Well, I think it can be a scary and intimidating word, community. You picture a field with people doing wonderful work, and you gather, and maybe there's a fireplace, and I don't think you need to start. Again, it's like directionality. And so I would say, like, what can you do if you have a partner? What can the two of you do together, for example? Or what can I do with my mother? Here's an example. What can I do with my mother? She's older now, she's 86, 87, so she's having a hard time. Me and my brothers are trying to do stuff for her. And I live kind of far away, so I can't be there that often. But I realized one thing I can do is I can buy groceries for her online and have it delivered to her door. And I sneak in the organic stuff, you know? Very, very stealthy, like she puts milk on the thing and I send her organic milk. She's paying for it. She's like, well, that cost a little extra. I'm like, yes, it did. And then I sneak in the organic everythings. And then we have a talk about that. And I make my case. And if she's really adamant, we had one chicken debate. I lost that one. So she got the kronfråga or whatever. So you win some, you lose some. But that's many steps from community. But it's still one big step from just I'm thinking about my own sopsortering. So I think taking one step, you don't have to move to an eco-village yet.
Thank you. Thank you for that tip. Mikael, I'm going to give you the opportunity now to reflect. There's some different threads going on, but like you said, I see commonality.
Oh, yes. Well, what Patricia talked about was really comes very close to my own sentiments about resistance and also about the existence of other ways of being a human being. And also in Mattias, in your film, I thought it was very moving to see your daughter and the reflections that you make, sort of these diachronic reflections over time. And I think that there's this movie by an Italian movie, La vita è bella. Have you seen this? Life is beautiful, or something like Livet är underbart in Swedish. And it's about a father who winds up in a concentration camp together with his son, if I remember correctly. And the situation in the concentration camp is unbearable, as in all concentration camps. But the father's duty towards his child is to secure a livable world, a world where the child can continue to live and find meaning and happiness. And so, in spite of everything that goes on, he inverts the world around them and transforms everything into a game just to keep the boy alive, because this is his duty. And so the boy survives, but he doesn't. And the boy survives not only physically, but also existentially. And I think that this is our duty. It's not a choice. It's not something that we cannot opt this out. We have to create a world for our children and our grandchildren that is livable. And so that is the moral duty that we have. And this is an impulse that I feel very strongly. And I think that You can talk about the source of this impulse in many different ways. Maybe it's genetics, or maybe it's God. Let's leave that question for a while. But the very strong sentiment of creating livable lives for our children and grandchildren, that is our absolute most important duty. In fact, the only duty that I have left. And so we have to create a cosmos in chaos. We have to create a story that revolves around the possibility for our children and grandchildren to continue to live. It has nothing to do with realism, but it has to do with, we have to create this story no matter what. This is I'm absolutely adamant about this. And how that story is then constructed, well, that's our job. But we have to, we cannot tell our children that the world is ending. We can tell them that one world is ending, that the world is transforming, but we cannot tell them this because it's not our right to do so.
Patricia.
I agree and disagree.
That's good.
Because I think, I mean, the film you mentioned, which is a very moving film that I remember surprisingly well, despite it having passed many years, so it must have made a deep impression of me. But it's also, the boy survives, but he wouldn't have survived if the regime didn't lose the war, right? So that's part of the conditions of the premises here, is that this is temporary, and if it's not temporary, then the boy will not survive either. So I think you're absolutely right that we have a duty. It's an imperative that we do everything we can to create a livable world to our children. And when I say our children, I mean not in the sense of possessive parent-offspring relationship, but the children that we have around us, to which we as grown-ups have a responsibility, regardless of who gave birth to them. I think it's really our obligation, but I also think that, I mean, partly it's narrative, but it does have to do with realism, because we need to prepare them. So what does it mean to create a livable world at this moment in history for our children? I think that is something that we need to discuss, because if we are really taking seriously that we are that this analysis, this narrative, that we are at the end of a world, be it in terms of climate, or be it in terms of democracy, or a combination probably of them too, then we also need to think about how do we not only create narratives, but help our children to be able to build community despite this. And I think especially in this part of the world that we are now, in Sweden, the Nordic country, Northern Europe, we have gotten very used to trusting the states we are living in. So it's something that we really need to discuss. What does it mean to say that we live at the end of a world when educating our children?
And do we? I mean, that's also a question.
That is a question.
We keep saying it all the time, but do we? Because I think that modernity is characterized by hubris, in the sense that we believe that we can control life. And now we believe that we can control our own death. And I think that is also hubris. We cannot control the destruction of our civilization. We could never. So I think that let's not do the same mistake again, to think that we tried to control life in every form for the past hundreds of years. And I think it's a mistake to think that we can control our own destruction.
No, I don't think we can control it, but I think we can explore, as you said before, different ways of being human, together with our children, together with the younger generations.
I'm going to go in Jurassic Park. You've seen the movie,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Many years. I don't remember that movie.
It's a wonderful film. You have to see it. Anyway, so they are trying to create this fantasy world with dinosaurs returning after 66 million years or something like that. And they have complete control over the reproductive capacities of these dinosaurs, they think. But of course, everything goes to hell, and because life cannot be controlled. And this is what one of the actors says in the film, life finds a way. And there is something of that uncontrollable aspect of life, that which cannot be the oförfogbara. I don't know the English word for it, that which we cannot control, and that is an integral part of life. I don't know if this is a source of optimism or not, but life finds a way, and I think that it does. Death will also find ways, more depressingly, but that is also the case. But life finds a way, and we are not gods. We have tried to be gods for the past 300 years. We have failed completely in that, so we cannot control it either.
Mattias, you had... what are your thoughts?
No, we were talking about children, and I was just another aspect of what you asked me earlier about stepping out of the just me and into perhaps not community, but what's the first step and doing with somebody else. And I just thought of the fact that making this film, approaching my daughter, she was 9 when we started, and asking her, because she's a big part of it. And I really sat down with her, because I thought, what will that mean for her? She doesn't understand the width of where it's going and stuff like that. But she just thought it was a fun project, and I tried to explain what it was. And just making it and having little sessions, going out, filming stuff, and it had led to some pretty interesting conversations. That's often a question about how can we tell the children what's going on without like putting them down in such a way that we extinguish their lights. And I don't know that I have the answer. And obviously, even if the answer is make a film, spend 2 years of your life, make a film with your daughter, that's a pretty bad advice. But that's one way. That's been a pretty special thing, and it's led to some very interesting conversations where she's asking some pretty frank questions, and yeah, and then death also comes into it. I was thinking about the Stephen Jenkinson story with a 7-year-old girl. I mean, that's a whole different realm, but just my daughter was talking about death the other day, and I was just like, well, those are the rules. I'm gonna die, you're gonna die. Everything that you hold dear is nothing. None of that's gonna last. I don't know how that tied in, but just talking about our children and how to relate, and yeah, full stop.
Everything is temporary. Also, in the case of La Vita Bella, the boy in the concentration camp, if he had died physically, his father could still perhaps secure an existential survival for him, so that he could live a full life, even if it's a short life.
No, that's true.
Thank you.
I keep talking about my film here, but I feel like I'm on a promotion tour. But there's one point in the end where, so the film has like an outward aspect where I go visit all these different projects, and then there's an inward, like me and my daughter, and more of this kind of stuff where it's like more philosophizing and stuff. And there's a line towards the end where I'm filming my daughter, she's playing with the dog and jumping around, and I'm saying that, I mean, I don't know what we're doing, all these things that I imagine to be some sort of a right direction. I really don't know if they are. I honestly don't. But they make me feel good about getting up in the morning. And, I mean, worst case scenario, we're like some kind of a band playing on a sinking Titanic. But best case scenario, it's something that I don't understand. And there's mystery there, and I feel like there's power in the mystery there. We could all be part of something bigger that we don't understand, and we don't know yet what the future holds. And I think it's important to do stuff that makes us catch ourselves whistling every now and then, just whether that is pulling potatoes out of the ground or something else.
Yeah. And well, you say we're also part of a mystery, and you're talking also about this feeling of control, or that we want to control. I'm thinking that we should open up the word to the audience, which we cannot control. Could I get someone to help out with a mic, some Seamus or Anders? There's a handheld mic somewhere. I think it's there.
I find it so interesting to listen to you, the three of you, because in my mind, you're talking about the same thing. You're talking about a good narrative, a good story for children and for grown-ups and for everyone. Really, it's so obvious. Your film, telling about the people in the Amazon. And Mikael, you are very explicit about it. You're convinced that we need to create meaning through narratives, through stories. Isn't that right?
Among other things, yes. Meaning can be created in many ways, but stories is one part of it, yes.
So would you please continue on that line? Because to me, being 72, I can't see anything more important than the human animal or whatever we are, to have a meaningful start. I mean, you get up in the morning whistling because you have meaning. Oh, don't destroy it now. To create meaning is very meaningful. And I don't know if I remember what you said, but something about the spiritual aspect of it. To me, I'm completely with you on that. The what we call religions or spirituality is nothing but creating meaning through connection with the gods or with the spirits or whatever way you choose. So how can we create meaning?
Good question. Could I just please, if you have a question, raise your hands, and I will try to remember who did it.
Should I comment on that briefly?
Yes. Do you so we have.
Do you want me to comment on the previous question?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I won't take much time for this, but I think meaning is not something that we can sort of give each other. We have to just give each other spaces to create meaning. And in the oral traditions of Native Americans, a good orator, a good speaker, speaks very, from my Washichu point of view, very imprecisely, with an imagery that opens up a field of associations. Among the Western Apache in the Southwest, American Southwest, explaining things too much is seen as a violation of the other person's intellect. So white people, when we define things, we kind of lock things into a meaning. That we have now, how do you define table? I define it in these terms. How do you define democracy? How do you define God or whatever? By doing that, we lock them in and they stop breathing. We kill them. Anything that we define in that sense, we kill. So the thing is to keep the world open and to create stories that are always open. So what in the oral tradition of Native Americans, usually you give people images and they will themselves have to create the meanings out of them in relation to their own life. So the question is, what kind of meanings can we tell about our lives? And we have different religious traditions, for instance, where we can find a lot of imagery that I find deeply meaningful, both in the Christian tradition and in other traditions. But there are also sort of secular stories you can find. But this is I don't have time to address this question. I'm sorry, more than this. But I'd like to talk about it later on, perhaps.
We still have a coffee break at the end of today, so
Exactly.
Patricia.
Just a very brief comment on the narrative too. Yes, I do think we're all talking about narratives, but I just want to ask us to remember that narratives also have a material dimension, and that how the impact of that materiality is felt. There's a very unequal distribution on that.
Thank you.
Should I?
Yes.
Thank you, all of you. I want to take the line from Patricia and Elaine Blom. So I admire her tremendously. And the connection is, and Patricia mentioned this 100 million displaced people. Saskia Sassen wrote a fantastic book about people being expelled from home and homeland. And then they are expelled into places they are not wanted. So Europe, as Fortress Europe, pays to this bastard of Erdogan billions to stop the Moroccan king, who is also not a Democrat. So the connection you mentioned, Patricia, capitalism. And for me, it's not just Trump of the United States. Putin, for me, he's part of machinery of state capitalism. Sometimes they refer to China as market socialism, you know. But look at wind power in Sweden. The Chinese are buying them, controlling in the West Coast and other places. So with capitalism, extractivism, and then the effect, and you mentioned, Patricia, very briefly, the danger to democracy. And I think this is part of what I think we need to address in stronger terms. And this is what Umberto Eco called il fascismo eterno, the eternal fascism. It didn't die last century. It is back with a vengeance. And this is Faccio Bolsonaro, you know, whose son works with Steve Bannon, who works in Italy training cadres. And the question is, yes, of course we need to address the issue that brought us here. But the connection, why are fascists and conservatives, even in Sweden, into climate denial? I see the nexus, and then how we respond in ways that can be understood by the public imagination.
Thank you. This was directed to you, I think, primarily. Do you want to respond? Not only,
but I do have a comment there. I think it's. I mean, I'm very concerned about precisely the questions that you are raising, and I think we need to see the connections, because these are intertangled phenomena that we see, and the displacement of people, which the number is growing, has been growing. I mean, I think in 2015 the UNHCR talked about 60 million people. Now the last number I found was 108 million. And this is something that is continuing and is aggravated by climate changes and ecological, local and regional ecological collapses. I lost my line now because I had a specific comment on that. Yes, but I think also, I mean, when we talk about democracy, we have also kind of incorporated the civilizational narrative. To go back to narratives is so strong, so that Sweden has a relatively stable democratic history for the last number of decades, different from, example, the states of Latin America. But even regardless if you are in Latin America or if you are in Sweden, there is a very strong kind of evolutionist narrative about democracy as being kind of the final stage of political development. So that when Bolsonaro was elected in Brazil and started his mandate with all his denialism, he was frequently by the opposition called a medieval politician, as if he was not a product of our political present. It is what the anthropologist Johannes Fabian, in a different context, but I think is still fitting, called the denial of coevalness. That which you don't like, you expel to the past, as if the present is not kind of the soil where it grew, right? So I really think we need to address those things and see how they go together, because if not, we have severe problems, and we already have, and people are suffering and dying because of them. So thank you.
Do we have any other comments up on the stage to that question? No? Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay,
please.
so I think it's me. Yeah, I think this question, I'm not sure if I can formulate it even, but I think it's directed to you, Mikael. You said that, you stated the obvious fact that of course we can't control what we think is the upcoming demise of our civilization. But it would be interesting if you would reflect a little bit about, as you all know, I'm trying to create this context, which I have named the project the Art of Dying, Ars Moriendi, for a reason. It stems from the thought that we as a civilization or as a society need to practice the art of dying together. And what I'm thinking in relationship to what you said about that we are obviously out of control, and it has been so all along because we're living creatures, but setting out with this consciously naive proposition that we can at least try to train ourselves or practice what a good death for this particular world might be, and how we can work on that together. If it's what I'm thinking, which is if you want to be critical about the problem at hand, I think, as being born into this thought frame of late modernity, and what capacity we have or lack rather to address these issues. The risk to just even in an vision like that recreate the current situation rather than addressing it. Was that comprehensible as a question?
For a while it was comprehensible. But thank you. Well, I think that practicing the art of dying is a very good thing for us as individuals, and it's one of the one of the main tasks, perhaps also for religious traditions, to train us in the art of dying and dying with dignity. Among the Lakota, you have death songs, still among the elderly people, so they know how to die. They have trained for this. I don't think that I'm trying hard to think about how a collective death should be, how we should prepare collectively for that, as ars moriendi for, so to say, for a whole society. But I think that when you look at literature and science fiction movies, once upon a time science fiction was kind of a positive, uplifting genre about the future, where we were flying around and we had robots doing all the menial tasks and stuff like that. Today, all these science fiction portrayals of the future are dystopias. That's the I haven't seen one single positive image of the future for the past 30 years in movies. Starting with Mad Max, we've had these terrible dystopias, one after the other. And perhaps this is our way of preparing for the demise of our civilization. I don't know. But popular culture fulfills a very extremely important existential role, especially in a secularized society like ours. So I think that that's part of the, not solution, but part of the answer to the existential questions that we have about our own demise. The answers come from popular culture to a large extent.
Yeah, I that just came up. Maybe there's one thing that may clarify a little bit what I'm after. It's my interest in our inability to discern biological and artificial life forms in this more and more artificial world we populate, and that our creations, like we have sort of missed there's no we say the aspect of finitude that is so important for evolution is lacking in our urge for permanence and everlasting institution and so on, and that's what I'm interested in addressing in the context of learning how to die.
Okay, thank you. It's not a question, but it's a statement. Thank you very much. Yes.
Now we have time we have two persons who want to ask a question, so we'll give time for you two. First here, yes, and then in the back.
Sorry, everyone. I know everyone's tired. This is a 6-part question. I had the benefit, quite the opposite, of having an extremely traumatic childhood. But what came from that was explanation from adults about each of those traumas. And I keep hearing, I've reacted because it was brought up earlier, about not telling kids. And I find that with my own children and the children who I am teaching about this subject very openly, but in a child-friendly way, they react very well. As someone who had to react to adult-type things as a kid, when it was explained to me by someone, by an adult, then I understood. The things that were not explained to me were the things I carried negatively, resentment toward those adults for not telling me the truth. So I just, as a general comment, would love to encourage people to not hide life from their kids. Here we don't take kids to funerals, we don't take kids to weddings. We're taking very key parts of life away from our children. And this, if there's ever a more important time to tell your kids what the hell's happening in the world, I think it's a good time to not hide it from them. That's all. Thank you.
I'd like just briefly to comment on that. Yeah, I definitely don't think that we should hide anything, but there are always, there are always a number of stories hidden in every truth. Every truth is multifaceted in that sense, and can be approached from a number of different angles. And if we say to someone, "You are going to die," we have to be absolutely certain that this is the case. If we say the world is ending, we have to be absolutely certain that this is the case. And I am not absolutely certain that this is the case. And I would never tell it to my grandchildren that the world is ending. For that reason. It's not hiding, but it's being honest to my own doubts. Because I hesitate about my own capacity of grasping the full picture. I have no idea. I have some idea, but I don't have a full idea about the future.
Thank you. One last comment or question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for this conversation, all four of you on stage, and thanks for all the questions. I'm starting to feel a little bit tired after these 3 days, but I guess my last reflection or comment would be, I'm looking at the title of this session, which was "What is yet to reveal itself, and how do we differentiate between the stars and satellites?" And this morning I had the opportunity of being able to reflect a little bit about, well, realize actually the importance of the important work of caring for the possible, to use the words of, I think, a Belgian philosopher, Isabel Stengers. So the care for the possible. And there's something in that's not in this title that I think is important in that. That it is actually that we need to care for that which is not yet here. Whatever we want to give, whatever name we want to give for that, and the possibilities in that are not yet here yet. So I would like to hear if there's any thoughts from any of you on stage, I guess, about how you would like to respond to that. How do you care for the possible in the times that we're living in right now? And how do we support others who are caring for the possible and perhaps carrying that heavy work? Because I think a lot of us academics actually tend to not do this very well. And that's maybe something we need to start doing, and we need to probably also depart, ta avsked från some other things to allow that to be more of a present quality in our work, is my feeling, at least within universities. And I guess, Mattias, you're lucky enough to not work within a university, so you can respond to some other part of this reflection from me. But Mikael and Patricia, I think you're both well aware of perhaps what I'm talking about. So yeah, any thoughts from any of you on stage would be much appreciated on this topic, because I'm trying to figure it out.
Thank you so much. Do you want to begin, Mattias?
Testing that. So, caring for the possible, is that too super short, what you said? I think I touched on it before in the, am I in a band playing on a sinking Titanic, or could it be something else? And I don't know what it is. But is it, I'll respond with a question back. Is it possible to care for something just by acknowledging that there might be something that you don't know what it is, and you're working for that, and you don't fully know how, and you don't know what it is, but it makes you sometimes whistle when you get out of bed in the morning? That's a weird answer, but that's my answer.
We're all weird here, so that suits us very well. Patricia, do you want to comment on it?
Yeah, I like to comment on the two last comments question together, because I think, coming back to what you talked about, Mikael, about the hubris of modernity, one of it is also that we even speak about the end of the world in generalized terms. It came to my mind this quote, which cannot be traced. I think it's Frederick Jameson said it first, but then he referred to someone else saying it's easier. We live in a time when it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And that has very much to do with the possible. I think it addresses your question as well, because I think what we have, the kind of narratives that we have given to our children, is the one that says that it's possible. Things are possible, explaining, but also that what might seem impossible today, that is also a convention, that is also like a construct. So I think caring for the possible, for me at least, I'm not sure that I address your question here, but I think caring for the possible is also to strive towards connecting to you, expanding the boundaries of the possible, by orienting oneself to the impossible, or to that which we have been told is impossible. And part of it is also to connect back again to things we spoke about a few minutes ago, reconnecting to this, that other worlds are not only possible, but they are existing. But we don't see them. And part of Eliane Brom's point, by making the Amazon the center of the earth, is to say that this is not something that concerns only the people in the Amazon. It doesn't concern only the indigenous people and the Beiraderos. It concerns the conditions of existence for all of us, not only because the Amazon is ecologically important, but also because it's a living example of other ways of organizing life and being human.
I would say that every pregnancy is about caring for the possible. And not only caring for the possible, but loving the possible, which I think is an interesting thing, that it's possible to love the non-existent person. But the love, as we know, who have been pregnant or expecting children, we know that we have love, not in anticipation of the person yet to come, but love for the possibility of this person. And so I think that caring for the possible is an absolutely necessity for our future, but not only caring, but actually loving it.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you very much. I thought you did an excellent job in tying all these webs together, or tying new knots in the web, rather. So I thank you very much for doing that.